Only a handful of nations, including Australia, despite denials, are still supplying arms to Israel, yet all of them are parties to the Arms Trade Treaty of 2014 that prohibits the sale of guns and bombs and planes and boats where there is an overriding risk that they will be used to commit war crimes. Not proof, just an overriding risk that they may be used to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, attacks directed against civilians, or other war crimes. The words of the treaty. Just the risk. Yet America, Germany, the UK, and in a small way, Australia, continue to supply the weapons that allow Israel to pursue its war in Gaza and its growing occupation of the West Bank. To discuss, I'm joined by the independent journalist and filmmaker Antony Loewenstein, author of the bestseller The Palestine Laboratory. Antony joins Late Night Live from Berlin, where he is filming his latest documentary. Antony, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
Antony, can any of the nations supplying arms to Israel credibly argue that there is no overriding risk that those arms may be used to commit war crimes?
No, is the short answer, and that's been acknowledged, in fact, by many states, often unofficially. As an example, this week in the UK High Court, I know we'll talk about this case, there are certain groups that are taking on the UK government about its export of parts for the F-35 fighter jet that Israel's using over Gaza. And the UK government admits that we actually do not know what happens to the weapons, the parts, when they arrive in Israel. So there's an acknowledgement that they don't know and frankly don't care. So the short answer is, if you are sending weapons to a country like Israel, if for that matter you're sending weapons to a country like Russia, engaged in a war in Ukraine, you're pretty confident and know that the weapons, the arms parts, whatever they may be, are going to be used in offensive tactics in the West Bank or Gaza or elsewhere. So it's utterly not credible, no.
What's the state that supplies the indispensable arms to Israel? What states?
The US is number one, has been for years. And after October 7, under President Biden, the US rushed huge amounts of weapons to Israel. There was a steady flow. We hear a lot during the Trump era now, including from pro-Israel types and some in the Trump administration, that Biden apparently was restricting some weapons. There was one cache of weapons that were held back for 5 minutes, but essentially Biden let the floodgates open and Israel was receiving billions upon billions upon billions dollars of weapons, ammunition, bombs, etc. The second country...
Just a second, Antony, just while we're on America, a couple of things. Biden stopped the export of huge bombs, did he not? 2,000-pound bombs.
For a very brief moment, yes, while huge amounts of other weapons were still being sent. I mean, Israel and its supporters claim that this somehow made it difficult for Israel to fight its war in Gaza, which is nonsense. Look, anyone, and I've spoken to people in Israel who say that there was never a moment when Israel did not have whatever ammunition and weapons and offensive tools they needed to fight what they regard as a justified war in Gaza, which many people would argue, including me, is genocide. So it's nonsense. Yes, Biden held it back for a brief moment, and it was around the context of Biden saying to Israel, you cannot go into Rafah, which is an area in Gaza. Israel ignored this. They went into Rafah, and Rafah is now leveled, which happened during Biden, has been worsened now since Trump came in. So, yes, there was a brief moment, David, but it was very, very brief.
Does the United States place any restrictions on the use that Israel can make of its weapons?
During the Biden administration, there were various departments within the State Department and the Defense Department which allegedly put some kinds of restrictions or checks. However, this is on paper, in theory. However, a number of people who have left the US government during the Biden era, I'm thinking of people like John Paul, people can Google him, he's a former senior official who was involved in looking at the sale of weapons to country X or country Y and assessing whether human rights would be abused. He has said on countless occasions, as others have, that there were no restrictions, that on other countries there was a degree of checks and balances, sometimes, not that the US is not selling weapons to many other human rights abusing states, but a country that had no practical checks and balances was Israel. It was the ultimate exception, and that's continued under Trump to the point where those minimal checks and balances that were very minimal have been all abolished. And Trump has, under so-called justification of Elon Musk and Doge, to remove these staff members in the State Department and Defense Department that were monitoring. But again, the monitoring was almost non-existent. They had a job on paper, but were not doing much in practice.
And the supply, is this gifts or sale?
It's both. It's both. One of the things that people often don't understand about the Israel-US relationship is that people say, well, the US gives every year anywhere between $3 to $6 billion of aid to Israel, which is true. It's certainly increased under Biden. It's possibly going to increase under Trump, although that's not clear at this stage. Some of it is a gift, and a lot of that money over the years has been weapons. But a lot of that has also been a less obvious form of a gift. In other words, there is a way in which the US contracts Israeli or American arms companies to provide and produce weapons that then get sent to Israel. So the reason that many senators, congressmen and women in the US are so keen to maintain the so-called close US-Israel relationship, yes, is for ideological reasons, but also that many in their districts are producing weapons in factories that are then sent to Israel. This is long before October 7. So it's a combination of both. But just finally, since October 7, the US has also sent huge amounts of more weapons to Israel, an unprecedented amount, in fact. And some of that has been for sale, and a lot of it has been as a gift.
What's the main kind of weapons that America supplies?
I mean, pretty much anything, David, you can imagine. Mostly offensive weapons. Israel, of course, develops its own technology, suicide drones and other things, but Israel had a massive lack of ammunition after October 7. The rate of destruction and killing in Gaza that Israel committed after October 7 was on such a massive scale that Israel was desperate for more ammunition. And yes, the US was sending it, but there's been amazing stories investigated of Israel trying to get all this ammunition through third parties, through various European partners, etc., which they mostly did. So it's a combination of things: huge bombs, massive bombs, bunker-busting bombs, including, for example, a bomb that was used in Lebanon to cause mass destruction, but also the death of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. So pretty much any weapon you can imagine, which alongside Israeli-provided weapons or produced weapons, is an unprecedented amount of munitions.
Now, the other principal supplier is Germany. What does Germany supply? And again, are there restrictions on what Germany supplies? Is it gifts? Is it sales? Has the supply by Germany been affected in any way by the progress of the war in Gaza?
So the amount of weapons that Germany has been sending Israel since October 7 and since Israel's response has been hundreds of millions of dollars in the Australian dollars. And we're talking again about a range of weapons, bombs, ammunition, etc. There was a brief moment last year in 2024 where there were growing public complaints and anger around Germany's uncritical support of Israel. And sales slightly went down, but they have continued in a very, very strong way. And Germany has always been a provider of weapons to Israel, and to some extent, Germany sees its so-called reason of state. That's the so-called stated reason why Germany must support Israel 110% regardless of its actions, and regardless, I might add, for the fact that a lot of Germans, according to public opinion polls, do not want Germany to sell that many weapons to Israel. So Germany has been a strong friend. In fact, just this week, the Israeli president arrived in Germany to a hero's welcome. I mean, I say hero's welcome, not with the public, because you couldn't access it, but from the government. But hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons. have flowed to Israel from Germany in the last 18, 19 months. And there's no indication with the new German government, which formed last week, that that will change. In fact, they're talking about increasing it.
If the US and Germany cease to supply Israel with weapons, could the war continue?
For a short time, yes. Israel, since October 7, has increasingly decided to produce far more domestic weapons, to have more factories in case there's a situation in years to come where a major country, Germany, the US or others, for whatever reason, decides not to provide weapons. So the short answer is yes. And the US and Israel, of course, gets weapons from other nations or supply parts, the UK, Australia and others. But the short answer is, in the medium term, Israel would have a problem. Yes, a major problem if the US and Germany, particularly the US, stop providing weapons, that they do not have the domestic capacity as of now to do so. So it's pretty clear that all these nations, Western nations and other European nations too, are deeply complicit in Israeli actions, and legally they face potential real ramifications in years to come.
I'm talking to Antony Loewenstein, independent journalist, author of the Palestine Laboratory, about the supply of weapons to Israel. Antony, have any countries stopped supplying, genuinely stopped supplying arms to Israel as a result of watching the course of the war in Gaza?
So the case of the Netherlands is very interesting. Netherlands obviously is a small country in Europe. It's not a massive player in this game. But soon after October 7, it was clear that the Netherlands was providing parts for the F-35, this fighter jet that Israel uses over Gaza. And human rights organisations took the Dutch government to court. There's been a bit of back and forth. The latest is in late 2024, and as far as I know, this has been the case, that the Netherlands is now not sending parts for the F-35. Now, in other countries, when courts have found that it's not legal, some states have continued to do so. So I can't stand here and guarantee that the Netherlands are not doing that, but courts have found that the Dutch government can no longer legally send those parts. So the Netherlands, Spain in
just
the last
on the
12
Netherlands,
months.
Just on the Netherlands for a second, the government's appealing that decision, isn't it?
They are. There's been back and forth. The government appealed that initial decision and then they lost that appeal. And my understanding is they're trying to appeal that. So yes, it's an ongoing situation.
So Spain's
an interesting case. Spain has said publicly on many occasions, because there's a strong pro-Palestine sentiment in that country, that they are no longer sending weapons to Israel. However, as has been reported in the Israeli press, Spain is still buying Israeli weapons since October 7 for itself, for its own armaments. Yes, indeed. So there is this crazy contradiction where on the one hand they are trying to appeal to the public to say we are standing up to Israel and we are not sending weapons. However, they are still buying weapons from Israel. So that is really, to some extent, David, the contradiction in so many nations in relation to Israel. And Spain is sadly a country that claims to be supportive of Palestine, and yet the reality is they're still buying huge amounts of armaments.
Now, Canada is on the list, isn't it, of countries that have stopped supplying?
No, Canada under the former leader Trudeau was a pretty strong supporter of Israel. That's continued under the new leader Mark Carney. They have, my understanding is they are still sending some weapons. It is reduced a bit in the tail end of Trudeau's reign. And obviously Carney's only been in there for a few months.
Okay,
Carney's made it very clear, by the way, he's made it very clear that he supports Israel and has not said, as far as I'm aware, that he will not send weapons to Israel.
Now, in February last year, Richard Marles, our Defence Minister, said that no export of weapons from Australia to Israel has happened for many, many years. And the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said Australia has not supplied weapons to Israel since the start of the Hamas-Israeli conflict. True, partly true, vague or false?
Well, also, I might add, Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, has said that as well, including during the recent election campaign. Well, it's not true, is the short answer, and let me briefly explain why. So all those three people you mentioned have said for at least 5 years Australia has not sent any weapons to Israel, so that obviously includes since October 7. But what Australia has been doing, this has been documented by journalists, including co-edit Declassified Australia, and one of my colleagues, Kelly Tranter, has done amazing FOI work on this, has found hard documents, evidence, there's no questioning of this, that Australia is a key partner in the F-35 global supply chain. So Australia is not sending a gun or maybe ammunition to Israel last week or the week before, but they are sending huge amounts of parts, often through the US, that go on to Israel. So as an example, the door that opens on the F-35 that allows the bombs to drop on Gaza or elsewhere are made here in Australia, or I'm in Germany, are made in Australia. And huge amounts of other parts. We recently did stories that in 2024, over $200 million of exports from Australia to Israel happened. Now, they weren't all weapons, they weren't, but some of them were parts that Israel could use in the making of weapons or the assembly of weapons. So when Miles and Wong and Albanese say this, they are being deliberately disingenuous. And I should also say that we revealed a few months ago that one Canberra-based company, EOS, has sold a counter-drone weapon to Israel, which has been, as far as we understand, used in Gaza since October 7. So the short answer is that could not happen without government approval. Now, I'm not saying that's approved by Albanese or Wong themselves, but it's approved by the government.
But Antony, doesn't it depend on your definition of a weapon? If those ministers mean a finished weapon, ready to go, ready to shoot, ready to kill, then it seems that we have not. The EOS R400, as I understand it, we make components, and those components are then assembled in America, and
which are then sent to Israel.
And then sent to Israel. And so we make bomb bays for the F-35, but the F-35 is assembled elsewhere.
Well, under international law, that argument, which I know you're making this in this interview, doesn't actually hold water because, yes, Australia may be sending, as we say, certain parts for an F-35 supply chain, which go to Israel and other nations, but they are used over Gaza at a time where Israel has been credibly accused of genocide in that conflict. So I don't think it's at all honest to suggest that Australia's role is somehow benign or we're doing it to support local defence partners, which
I'm
is
just
obviously the case.
I'm just saying that we need to read very carefully, with our KC hats on, what governments say about the supply of weapons. KC hats are required, which gets us to the United Kingdom, which, like Australia, has been insisting that it does not supply weapons to Israel. But lately, that claim has been challenged. Now, what's happening in the UK at the moment about all of this?
So there's two parts to that. The UK government under Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and this was the case when the Conservatives were in power too, before him, have been a key partner in the F-35 supply chain, like Australia. And in the High Court this week, as we speak, the British government is being taken to court by various human rights organisations from Palestine and the UK, claiming that their involvement in the F-35 supply chain makes them complicit with genocide. That's part of it. The other part, which is there was a report that came out a few weeks ago from various British human rights organisations, which found that even though the British government claimed in September 2024 that they were stopping sending some weapons that could be potentially used for breaches of international law, in fact, a lot of weapons have continued to be sold, offensive weapons, ammunition and other things that are directly used in the war in Gaza, but other kind of munitions as well. So the UK government, and it's interesting to note that the UK government's so-called defence in the High Court, and I'm paraphrasing here what the barristers have said, is we cannot stop sending these parts because it will impact negatively our foreign relations, namely with the US and Israel. And even if human rights abuses are taking place in Gaza or elsewhere, it still would not mean that we should or could stop the sending of F-35 parts. Now, that's their words, not mine. That really, I think, goes to the heart of what we're talking about here, that the reason why the UK, I would say Australia and others, continue to send parts of weapons, sometimes via the US, sometimes directly to Israel, is because they see themselves as integral to a pro-Israel so-called Western consensus. I guarantee you, David, if the US tomorrow, the US, which they won't, but if they came out tomorrow and said, we are ceasing all weapons exports to Israel, Australia would follow the day after. These are not independent decisions that Australia is making, or the UK.
Antony, on the F-35, wasn't the situation that these fighter jets are phenomenally, obscenely, outrageously expensive, and that one of the ways in which Britain and Australia was persuaded to buy these planes is that some of the manufacture would be done in their countries. And this is the fundamental contract to make us customers of these planes. Isn't that the case? Israel is off to one side here. This is about the making of those planes.
Well, that's an argument, yes, that was made by certain states when they signed up for these. But I mean, the idea somehow that, this is a similar argument that says that we should, as a country, Australia, support the US or Israel because we have some jobs in a factory in Melbourne or Tasmania or Brisbane. This to me has no relation to international law. That suggests that the F-35 can be used in any way against any civilians anywhere, and somehow it's justified or defensible because of business interests, corporate interests, political interests. And I'm well aware, obviously, of the so-called justification that's used to defend these kinds of exports. But Australia is finding itself, including certain officials, including ministers, at risk of serious breaches of international law by their complicity. This is exactly what's happening in the High Court in the UK at the moment. Now, Keir Starmer is not about to be sent to The Hague, nor is Anthony Albanese, but their involvement in these programs, particularly the F-35 and others, leaves them hugely legally vulnerable. There's no question about that.
Antony, what's been the response of Israel to the recent controversy, particularly within the UK, about the supply of weapons to the war?
Well, little comment. Israel, of course, says that they require these planes and these weapons to fight their so-called justified war in Gaza, but I'm not really sure who believes that anymore. Israel is well aware that certainly under Trump and frankly under Biden, that the flow of weapons has continued. In fact, since Trump came into office, he's expanded and sent far more weapons to Israel for its war of annihilation in Gaza. So I think Israel would feel relatively comfortable that those flow weapons will not stop. If Australia, for example, stopped the providing of F-35 parts, would the war continue? Yes, it would. But Israel would need to find places where those parts would be made elsewhere. And to me, Australia could play a very significant role. And we're not talking about huge amounts of money here. Australia not being involved in this work is not losing tens and tens of billions. But frankly, David, even if it was, which it's not, we're breaching international law by our complicity, as is the UK, as is other nations, of course, as is the US.
Antony, there's been some commentary lately with the visit of Trump to Saudi Arabia that there are signs of a gap opening up between Netanyahu and Trump. Do you see signs of that?
If only I thought that was true. Look, it seems to be on some issues, David, that is the case. There was a release this week of a hostage from Gaza, an Israeli-American, and the negotiation happened without Israel at all. It was between Hamas and the US, which of course should have happened, in my view, a long time ago. There is some indication that the US obviously is keen to make a deal with Iran. Israel's not happy about that at all. But I'm skeptical of it, and I'll tell you why. Because during the Biden era, we constantly heard in the media, Biden's upset with Netanyahu, Biden is so concerned, Biden is pissed off with Netanyahu's obstinacy. And yet we find, which we knew at the time, but 2 weeks ago, a lot of Biden officials spoke on an Israeli TV show. And essentially they said there was no serious push by us, the Americans, ever for a ceasefire, ever, in the entire Biden administration. So from October 2023 to the time Biden left office in January this year. So yes, there does appear to be sometimes a difference in worldview or perspective between, say, Trump and Netanyahu. That does seem to be the case, but ultimately the war of annihilation, David, continues in Gaza, and the plan that the US and Israel are cooking up to allow aid in, which at the moment is causing literal starvation in Gaza, is a plan to be run by US mercenaries in Gaza that is only supposed to feed 60 to 70% of Gazans at the barest minimum. And it reminded me, David, of WikiLeaks released all these documents about 15 years ago, and one of them, which people can find easily online, is the document showed that between 2007 and 2010, which is the beginning of the blockade when Israel imposed it, Israel was literally counting calories of what was being allowed into Gaza, so Palestinians there wouldn't starve to death, but would not be healthy. Nothing has changed in this period of time, and I see a real repeat of that. So to your question, maybe there's some distance here and there between Netanyahu and Trump, but the ultimate plan here is that Gaza doesn't exist anymore, David. There's nothing there. I mean, people live there. There's
a lot of
roughly 2 million.
A lot of broken concrete, Antony.
Well, massive broken concrete, and broken lives, and 50 to 100,000 Palestinians who have been murdered. But what is the goal here? The goal, again, Netanyahu stated this week clearly, and Western leaders, including our own, know this. They know the plan is to either empty Palestinians from Gaza or to push them into a quasi-concentration camp, which is what Israel wants, and starve them, surround them, make their life so intolerable that they may accept if country X or country Y, which Israel would bribe or sell weapons to, would say, we'll take 10,000 here, 20,000 here. That is the goal.
Well,
and I don't see any indication, by the way, that the US is opposed to that. And that's the horrific reality.
thank you, Antony, for bringing us up to date with the situation with weapons supply and for a vivid expression of your argument about what's going on in Gaza, for which we are grateful. Thank you for joining us on Late Night Live. I've been speaking to Antony Loewenstein, independent journalist, author of, amongst other books, The Palestine Laboratory.